I want to begin my comments on media in Australia and how the Palestine-Israel issue is covered with a tale of disillusionment from my youth. Back in 1994, I took a job in the Department of Transport in Canberra, where I was placed in the area dealing with the excitement of road transport policy for my sins, which is trucks. And I thought I knew about trucks, about how they were big and bad and dangerous and driven by drug-fueled cowboys, and about how if we only spent money on our rail network, we wouldn't need so many trucks and we could get these menaces off the road. And this was, at the time, and perhaps to a degree still is, it was the conventional narrative presented in the media, particularly when it covered truck accidents. And there were an awful lot of quite tragic truck accidents back in the early 1990s. When I began doing my job, I discovered that things like that you could spend billions of dollars on rail and not even slow down the rate of growth of freight on our roads. Trucks were simply better than trains at moving stuff. And in fact, the economics of trucks made a whole lot more sense than the economics of trains. And all of that came as a great surprise to me. And I realised after a while that every time I read a story about trucks in the media, that there was a pretty good chance it would be consistent with the media's preferred narrative rather than with the facts. And why am I telling you this? Well, the lesson I drew from this moment of disillusion was that if the media so regularly got it wrong in an area where I finally had some detailed knowledge, I wondered, what else was it getting wrong? Was it getting it that wrong on every other subject? I certainly hoped not. And of course, that the mere existence of facts that countered the media narrative didn't mean a great deal. This wasn't even a particularly controversial area. It's trucks. I mean, there's no big lobby group pushing a trucking agenda or a rail agenda. There are no political parties that represent the interests of one sector or another. How much worse, I wondered, was it in areas where vested interest and politicians pushed a particular line about an issue? Well, let's scroll forward 25 years. And our media actually now looks very, very different to the media that I was looking at back in 1994. The media workforce I find quite interesting because there's an entirely new medium, the internet. There's now a pay TV sector in Australia. There are a wide variety of digital-only publications in Australian journalism. There's a lot more TV and radio broadcasters. You don't notice it in the cities, but out in rural and regional areas, there's a lot more broadcasters than there used to be. But despite that proliferation of media, there's actually about the same number of people employed in the Australian media as there were in 1994, or probably less. Despite the fact that in that time, the Australian workforce has grown by around 50%. Now, there's quite a bit of contention about this issue, which we've actually covered in Crikey. There's at least one study that came out last year that argued that overall, the number of journalists employed in media companies in Australia is actually growing, not, as you might sense from, particularly from recent events, declining. And indeed, the current CEO of Fairfax insists that there are more journalists employed now than 25 years ago. But recent years have seen a succession of cuts to editorial staff at major newspapers. There's speculation about the closure of the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age print editions. News Corporation, which routinely sacks journalists but doesn't do it with anything like the publicity that Fairfax does, has been losing quite significant sums on its newspapers. And alas, for News Corp, Foxtel is no longer the cash powerhouse that it used to be that could be used to offset those losses. And we know what's driving this. It's the decline of advertising revenue driven by the internet. It's one of these, there's always two things that strike me about whenever there's a focus on Fairfax and its staff cuts is one, News Corp's doing much the same thing but is much cleverer about doing it in secret rather than more openly. And the second is that it'd be good if everyone who lamented the decline of journalism at Fairfax actually had a subscription, and I assume that they do, because otherwise it would be arrant hypocrisy to complain about it and not actually provide any sort of funding support. Now, regardless of what you think of them, Fairfax and News Corp, along with the ABC, provide the backbone of journalism in Australia. And of course, the ABC itself has been targeted for politically inspired cuts, funding cuts by the Abbott-Turnbull government. So whatever the situation is with the numbers, what no one contests, I think, is that editors and journalists and producers have to now produce far more content in less time across more platforms. And journalists are being required to cover more rounds, so they write with less experience and industry knowledge. An article on trucks in 1994 would probably have been written by someone who had a good understanding of the transport industry because he or she specialised in it. Sydney Morning Herald actually has Jake Solwick, who's a transport, carries a transport round now, but he just covers transport, I think, mainly in Sydney rather than looking at things like trucking policy. The overall number of specialist journalists, I think, is decreasing. There are still political journalists, of course. I work in the press gallery and the place is full of them, although not quite as full as it was when I started 8 years ago. There are national security and defence specialists, there are court reporters, there are still specialist reporters. But those who have the luxury of concentrating on a single round and therefore getting to know it really well are decreasing. More and more, the news is being written by generalists, increasingly young generalists, particularly now broadcasters, covering multiple rounds who are too harried and too busy to be able to take the time to properly inform themselves of a subject area. And our media companies, because they've got less money, send far fewer journalists overseas, and the ones that do tend to go to Anglophone countries that are more likely to generate the sort of news that Australians are interested in. Even the ABC, following the Coalition's budget cuts, recently cut 20 positions in its foreign bureaus and condensed its operations into global hubs rather than operating a network. So the result is, if we're lucky, a greater reliance on hard-pressed video journalists who tend or are much more likely to operate on their own, or otherwise a greater reliance for foreign news on overseas media, which for Australia, of course, is mainly American and British media. So in a way, we're outsourcing the task of getting balanced coverage on foreign affairs or specific issues, such as the Middle East, to foreign media companies. Now, this change that's been going on for so long is great news for PR firms, of course. It's long been standard for PR firms to not merely pitch stories to journalists, but provide the whole story themselves, complete with interviews and video footage to time-poor journalists who are being pressed for content by editors. It's great news for vested interests that have resources to invest in media product. You commission independent modelling or conduct independent surveys that demonstrate the benefits of a policy that you support or the costs of a policy you oppose, and you give it to a journalist exclusively, of course. And you may very well get a front page run if it suits the agenda of the media outlet concerned. And most of all, it's great news for those who benefit from established narratives, because journalists with less time and fewer resources are less able to engage in the kind of analysis that threatens dominant narratives. And the dominant narrative in the Australian media about Israelis and Palestinians is not a positive one for Palestinians. Israel is a kind of Western island in the Middle East, familiar Anglophone people like us, who do things the way we do them, allegedly the only democracy in the Middle East. Palestinians, who of course don't even have their own country as a basic tool of self-definition, officially, are none of those things. They're other. They're not like us. And not merely are many of them Muslim, which comes with it an entire set of stereotypes and demonisation, but they're prone to terrorism and they're always angry. I've often thought that the Western media's emphasis on Palestinians, and indeed Muslims more generally, as eternally angry, was an important part of their demonisation. Because even if you accept that they might have something to be angry about, no one likes someone who's always angry, always protesting. No real person's always angry, constantly expressing the, constantly emphasising the anger of a group, I think is a subtle form of dehumanisation. And it's actually not necessarily a trope that's confined to pro-Israel narratives. so many Middle Eastern commentators used to be fond of the expression, the Arab street will explode, creating the sense via word choice of a monolith that can only react with anger and violence rather than reason. Now, it's important to note this narrative about Israelis and Palestinians is not uncontested. You can find individual news stories that are inconsistent with it, often very good ones. But narratives are rarely pure and uncontested. They're more about the paradigm that journalists operate in, the assumptions they need to question in order to bring balance to their reportage. And it's often more about what doesn't get reported rather than what does. Story selection and omission are much more effective tools of censorship than outright biased reporting. This doesn't merely apply to, for example, to pick, I think, the most obvious example, a staggering contrast in death tolls on each side of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Take a different kind of issue, which has always fascinated me, which is the stereotype of Islam as a religion that is uniquely oppressive of women, which regularly gets played out in the Australian media and in politics. When was the last time you read in the Australian media about the repeated instances of disruption to Israel-bound flights by Orthodox Jews who refused to sit next to female passengers, or the Orthodox Jewish sect that banned women from driving in North London? And that's before we get to the systematic misogyny and exclusion of women by Christian institutions in Australia. And even if there is some occasional balance in reportage on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there's one narrative that virtually never gets challenged in the Australian media, that of contextless terrorism. This narrative almost has the status of holy writ in Australia and is a staple of war on terror rhetoric, that Islamist terrorism is induced simply by the existence of an innocent West doing nothing more than enjoying its political and social freedoms, with no connection to Western policy decisions or Western military interventions in the Middle East, occupations or support for oppressive regimes. And Palestinians, I think, get their own version of this. Violence by Israel is always contextualised. It's always in response to some provocation, whereas Palestinian violence is decontextualised, stripped of meaning or rationale, a narrow version of the "they hate us for our freedoms" logic of the war on terror. And I suspect that as journalistic resources diminish, as the ABC and as companies like Fairfax and News have less money to invest in quality journalism, the capacity for vested interests to influence coverage, to promote a dominant narrative, is going to proportionally increase. So the study too was operated by the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, and AJAC are a long-established means of influencing media coverage. AJAC also actively seeks to influence the decreasing number of Australian journalists being sent to cover the Middle East and attacks those who fail to toe the party line. Last year, the ABC's new Middle East correspondent, Sophie McNeil, was, in what's almost becoming a rite of passage for people taking that job, attacked by AJAC and by fellow travellers like Labor MP Michael Danby before she'd even begun reporting. And that's supplemented in Australia by a stable of far-right Islamophobic commentators, primarily at News Corporation, although Fairfax has had its own recent problems in that regard, who can be relied on to assert a pro-Israel line on virtually any issue. And it's the fact that you can rely on them to do it that is important. Whether it's relating to Palestinians, the behaviour of the openly racist Netanyahu government, US support for Israel, or attacks on Iran. They provide, I think, an environment in which rank Islamophobia is still considered acceptable in Australia in a way that most other forms of bigotry are not. And even if you disagree with that, certainly there are no reliable, reflexively pro-Palestinian commentators in the Australian media. So I think the problem we face is that these institutional forces that encourage the dominant narratives will not lessen, whilst journalistic resources will. But I do want to end on a more positive note, because I think there's been another change in the Australian media that isn't necessarily as bad as what I've been talking about so far. I think because of social media, many journalists are now being exposed not merely to readers' and viewers' reactions to their work, but a much wider range of source material. And Twitter, in particular, is disproportionately influential. About a year ago in Crikey, we ran a poll that showed 42% of Australians use Facebook daily, but only 5% use Twitter daily. So Twitter is not a mass medium by any stretch of the imagination. It's boutique, it's niche. But that 5% includes most journalists and commentators and politicians in Australia. And as a consequence, material shared on Twitter stands a much greater chance of being seen by someone whose views are worth influencing because they can influence others. So I think today's discussions are actually enormously important. It feels peculiar, certainly to me, to be focusing on something as ephemeral and trivial as social media when we're dealing with an issue that's literally a matter of life and death for Palestinians and for Israelis. But social media, and I think especially Twitter, do have a capacity to influence the influential in the media. It's a terrible means for engaging in rational debate. But it's an outstanding means of propagating material, whether it's true or whether it's lies. And I think, therefore, it's a space that anyone genuinely interested in seeing balance in the coverage of Middle Eastern issues must be in and must be engaged with purpose and with resources. Because it does offer one of the few remaining mechanisms by which the dominant media narrative can actually be challenged. Thank you.